Show, February 26, 1981. Before we begin, would you like to give me a brief background of how you came to Ball State?
How I came to Ball State? I came here in May of 1970. I was prior to that time, a member of the faculty at SMU, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. I had been there for 3 years. I was interested in moving back to the Midwest for family reasons. I was unhappy with where I was, and I knew two of the faculty members here, one very well. We had discussions, they recruited me, and I came.
About 1970, would you say that when you came here you were hit with the peace movement, or were you very aware of it at the time?
I wasn't exactly hit with it. No, I first made a public declaration of my opposition to the war in May of 1966 in the very first public display, organized national public display. I was at that time at Memphis State University in the faculty there. So I marched in Memphis then. So my personal opposition to the war was by 1970 a good 6 years old. SMU was not an active campus. I used to joke that a student riot there consisted of 3 students stepping on the grass at the same time. And I found Ball State to be a pretty placid place as well. I did not consider Ball State to be a hotbed of student opposition or a hotbed of outspoken opposition to the war at all. In fact, it was a fairly placid place given the tenor of the times in 1970.
Do you believe that this was in part the administration's attitude toward student behavior?
No, I think it was the kind of students who are here. Fairly much, although the thrust of the institutions is very different, SMU and Ball State are quite similar in that regard. SMU is a private school, Ball State's a public school, but both were places where at that time, and probably continually, people sent their kids, and teenagers opted to come here because it was a safe place to go. If the 1960s, particularly the last couple of years of the 1960s and the early 1970s, were not particularly pleasant times. And having lived through it, having predated those times and postdated them, I'm not so sure I liked it all. It was just not pleasant to be at a university. And that extended to a lot of things, not just a question of opposition to the war, but students were in rebellion. Some acts of wanton vandalism, which I could in no way support, had occurred on other campuses, such things as trashing the card catalog in the library, things of that sort. So that Ball State and schools like it were places where you could send your kids and they weren't going to get smashed in the mouth, where they were not. Also, the unfortunate side of that is that you'd send them to a school where you thought they weren't going to get their heads pumped full of a lot of nonsense. So I think the placidity of Ball State really relates to the type of students who are here, and that hasn't changed. That's still the same. It has not been a hotbed of intellectual ferment, was never designed to be so, and may never become such. That's far more important than any attitude that the administration takes about what they're going to do if students burn a flag on the steps of the administration building. The point is, not very many students would decide to do that, and they'd have very little support from their peers if they did so.
How did you first become involved with the peace movement? Did you?
Well, I guess I wonder what you mean by the peace movement. I was a part of it, and had been for a long time. As regards, are you asking as regards any particular kinds of things on this campus?
Yes.
Okay. I think I became involved through the classroom more than anything else. I taught the survey course in 20th century United States history, and I taught black history. I also began to teach recent U.S., an upper division course. Probably out of the first one, that is the survey course, I encountered a number of students who reacted positively to my position on the war. I did not seek actively to recruit students in my classes to any point of view, but I made no secret of the fact that I thought that the current war was ill-advised and something not to be proud of. So there were a couple of students, oddly enough, who contacted me out of huge classes that I taught, 225 student classes, and with whom I became friends. One in particular was a Vietnam veteran, and he was eager to talk with somebody about his experiences. We became very good friends. I think largely through his efforts and his activity, he became involved in what was then beginnings of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and he asked me to speak to that group, and I did. Eventually, I became their faculty sponsor because they needed a sponsor. I am not myself a veteran of anything. I never did serve in the military. So I felt a little awkward being in that position, but the whole thing was awkward.
How did students react to your verbalizations about returning to the war in the classroom?
In the classroom? Well, I tried to stay off the soapbox. I don't know whether I succeeded or not, because I really don't think the classroom is a proper place for that. I might say I had begun doing that back when I was at Memphis State in 1965. I scheduled several out-of-class sessions because people asked me what my opinion was about the war, and I said I'll be glad to discuss it at length with you if we want to meet outside the class, and we did that. My point is that I was dealing with three sets of students in three different universities during that time: Memphis State, SMU, and Ball State, and I don't think I could make any great distinctions between them as to their reactions. If they didn't like what I was saying, most of them probably cowed because they were students and I was the professor, didn't want to argue with me, although we occasionally had discussions about the wisdom of the war. I would say by and large they tended to be opposed to its continuation. After all, this was 1970 and 71. By that time it was quite different to be opposed to the war then than it was, say, in 1966. We clearly had lost the war by that time, and we clearly were in a situation where continued fighting seemed even more pointless than it had been before. So I think the attitude by 70 and 71 was pretty overwhelmingly against continuing the war.
What do you think the feeling of community once he was like during this time, having students who were opposing the war and doing actively protesting it? What do you think the community was feeling at that time?
My perception then was that they were fairly hostile, that the community regarded the students who were opposed to the war as so much riffraff.
Do you have anything to substantiate that?
Well, their behavior on those occasions when it was public. The most loutish behavior belonged to the opponents of the war. I mean, they were the ones who shouted obscenities out the windows and shot the finger at everybody and generally behaved in a pretty loutish fashion, I thought. Just comments that I received, letters to the editor, editorials in the paper. I think generally the townspeople were hostile to the university and to students, because again the nature of students changed and the number of students changed, and there were a substantial number of people in the community, I suspect, who thought that Muncie was in danger of being overrun by Ball State and the scruffy character who comprised the student body.
How did the students react to Kent State on campus?
I was not here at that time. I was still at SMU when that occurred.
Do you think that the fact that Kent State had occurred affected the community's feelings toward the students then? Do you think that
I don't know.
might have changed it?
I really don't know. I was involved 2 years after I came, sometime in 71, 72, to substantiate the statements I made about the attitude towards students, in a movement that began on the campus to register students to vote. In other campus towns throughout the country, it had become accepted that students could register and vote there. And a number of the people who wished to vote here were also in an anti-war posture. And we held a march in which several faculty members, along with maybe 50 to 70 students, marched carrying an American flag, wearing stickers that said, "Vote, register to vote." That's all they said and all we did. We marched to the courthouse. Cars honked, people flipped the bird at us. They were refused the opportunity to register, and the general reception on the part of the community, with the exception, I might say, of Sheriff Jim Carey, who handled it, I thought, very well, was quite hostile, and they were not allowed to vote. So I concluded from that they were afraid that the student body was going to take over the town, that they were very suspicious of students, that they were fairly hostile towards students, and there was a very uneasy relationship there. Even doing something as patriotic as registering to vote just scared the daylights out of them.
Do you remember the May Day incident on the May Day March to Washington in 71?
I suspect that that was that a number of the Vietnam veterans against the war participated in that. It's a little unclear in my mind. The chronology is not that clear in my mind. It may have been a year later that they did that. Is that accurate? That the Vietnam veterans indeed organized. There was a display in which veterans paraded in front of along the mall and pitched in their medals and came in wheelchairs and so on. And now that may have been in the summer of '71. It may have been in the summer of '72. And several people from here went. Yes, about maybe a half a dozen to a dozen veterans.
Who were also students on campus?
That's right.
Okay. What other experiences have you had with the veterans against the war? What type of resistance did you show?
Well, my first contact with them was really in the role of a kind of a teacher. I found that this group was the most, there was something very special about this group of young men. They had been drafted, most of them. They had been asked to serve their country. They had gone through all the efforts of being trained, and they had served, they had done their time, they had in some cases risked their lives, and in other cases hadn't particularly. They'd been in the, not everybody who was in the Army at that time was slogging through the jungles of Southeast Asia. And now they were out, and their experience was summed up by one of them very poignantly to me. He said, "Well, I didn't know why I was being sent there. I didn't know why I was there when I was there. And afterward, I didn't know why I'd been there." And I think they were completely ignorant of any of the issues at stake. So my initial contact with them was a series of about 3 different nights in which we just went over kind of the history of the Cold War, the whole historical context in which the United States had become embroiled in Southeast Asia. And they were extremely rapt in their attention. They were fascinated. I think I gave them a fairly one-sided view of it, but I tried to present the whole picture of it. And that was our first contact. I think just their beginning to try to figure out why they'd been there was an important step for them, and I'd like to think I helped them in that. They then went on to several kinds of public protests. There were kind of 2 schools of thought. One, this was not a large group. At any given meeting, there might be anywhere from 6 to 15 people. One group wanted to have public demonstrations and symbolic kinds of things like carrying a coffin, elaborate ceremonies with their wearing their uniforms or their ribbons or whatever they had. And another group didn't want to do that kind of thing, thought it was too theatrical and didn't lead anywhere, and thought that people had been sensitized enough. They wanted, I'm not really sure what they wanted to do, whether they wanted to try to educate other people, that kind of thing. So there were a number of episodes of that sort. Probably the best remembered one around here, I've heard it referred to on a number of occasions since then, was the time that they threatened to burn a dog on the lawn of the administration building. They announced that there was going to be a burning of they were going to burn a dog in front of the administration building at noon, and a huge crowd assembled. There was a tremendous hue and cry about the inhumanity of all of that and everything else. Naturally, they had never intended to do it. They just wanted to get all those people out to point out to them the curious attitude they had, that while people were being bombed and burned in Southeast Asia, they blithely went around about their business, but the threat of hanging or burning a dog brought them out in outrage, and they made their point fairly effectively. They used the occasion then to rail against the war, which was about all that anybody could do.
About how many people would you say showed up for that?
Oh gosh, it's hard to estimate the size of the crowd, but I would, several hundred. I don't, a bigger crowd than usually gathered at those things.
Now, was this one of the activities of the Vietnam veterans against
Mm-hmm.
the war?
Mm-hmm. I think so. Well, it's hard to determine what one would mean by active. They formed a group. They met regularly. They participated in all of the public marches that occurred. Whenever there was a march, somebody from that group was in it, whether it was in Indianapolis or in Washington or in Muncie. They attempted to, they I suspect, tried to publicize the issue. Now, that whole movement, which naturally took a while to build, because you don't get a group of veterans against the war until you've got a group of discharged veterans who will come out. It's going to come late in the game. That group, in a sense, posed the most serious threat. The veterans posed a threat to the administration point of view that was a much more serious one than anyone else. The activity of the veterans changed the whole nature of protest, because as long as it was college students and others, the military, the administration, super patriotic citizens, whomever, could characterize opposition to the war as a lily-livered, yellow-bellied opposition of a bunch of scruffy draft dodgers who were too much sissies to go out and fight for their country. They couldn't say that about the veterans. That really took their whole argument and shoved it right back in their faces. And they floundered a bit with that one, because now here were a whole bunch of people who paid their dues. There were people who wiped out the enemy, people who'd thrown hand grenades into houses and bombed out folks. Here were romping, stomping, duly certified killers on the loose now, who said, "What in the hell were we doing over there?" So the veterans changed the whole nature of the protest, and you could see that because fairly soon the administration, either usually through some spokesperson for the Defense Department, sent around a new set of truth squatters who came around and now talked about how the issues there were fairly complicated ones. I remember the man who was sent here by the Defense Department to justify what was going on, and one of his major thrusts was to downgrade the veterans against the war, to say, well, you really couldn't expect a bunch of ignorant people who'd been brought off the streets who didn't know how to pronounce Da Nang. You couldn't expect them to understand the issues in the war. After his speech, which was in the ballroom in the Student Center, I talked to a couple of the men in the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and they definitely felt that they had been put down. I had imagined it, but they certainly believed that his remarks were directed against them and attempting to undermine their credibility. But I think that the emergence of a body of veterans against the war really did push the administration further in a direction that they didn't want to go, and did make it more difficult for them to continue to wage the war. As I say, you just couldn't anymore say that anyone who was opposed to the war is a draft dodger. You couldn't say that anymore.
Were there any specific recollections that you had that you'd like to share?
Well, I have some recollections of hostility. We had a meeting one night, and about a dozen of the men were there, and the wife of one of them came rushing in and was extremely upset, extremely flustered. She had just received a telephone call at home from someone who said that they had a lead present for her and her husband. It didn't take too much imagination to translate that into a death threat. That's one example of community hostility.
You feel that that was a community?
Well, I don't know who it would be if it was. Maybe it wasn't, but it was certainly hostility. I just really enjoyed my association with that group. I don't think that I was any great leader for them or anything, but I think that they were glad to find somebody who was willing to sign on a dotted line for them to rent a room, to do the other kinds of things. They were a duly recognized campus group. I have no idea how much surveillance or anything else was directed toward them. They were just a good bunch. I could appreciate their directness and their concern. They were a very differing set of people. All that they shared was their experience at having been in the armed service and at opposing the continuation of the war. That's about all they shared. It was a lot. I didn't feel any pressure at any time because of my participation. Maybe I wasn't that visible and maybe people didn't know. But I do not have any perception that my involvement with them did anything in any way to undermine my position as a faculty member here. So I was, in my case, I would say there was zero negative impact. I risked nothing.
Do you have any recollections of violence on campus against maybe perhaps people that were pro-war against people?
I don't. I think there were occasional shouting matches. There was occasional concern that some of the other types might try to start something, but I don't know that anything ever came of that. I think there was something special about the veterans, whether justifiably or not. I think that even a group of very outnumbered husky college students would hesitate to do anything with them. They probably have a stereotype of them as a bunch of romping, stomping killers who would, throw a hand grenade in their pocket or something. But I don't think they ever experience a direct kind of thing.
You mentioned earlier that administration had to change its approach to the movement after the veterans came into play. Were there any restrictions that the administration put on the organization?
Oh, by administration, I mean the Nixon administration. I'm sorry. I'm not talking about Ball State at all. No. Maybe, well, there's no way to get that earlier in the tape. No, I'm thinking of the Nixon administration entirely. I was never aware of there ever having been any official administration position about the war or about opposition to the war. If there were difficulties, they certainly passed me by.
Do you have anything else that you'd like to add?
I can't think of any particular kind of thing. It was a very emotional time. I think that the collective efforts of people like the Vietnam veterans against the war did ultimately have an impact. And I guess maybe it was because they'd been there and didn't have to apologize to anyone. I suspect that a lot of other veterans regarded them as almost even traitors, but it didn't deter them.
How did the other veterans who weren't opposed to the war treat or react to your organization?
I really don't know. I never got any sense of that. I know that there were other veterans on the campus who had been in support of the war, but I don't ever remember any. It may be that I'm forgetting, or maybe that I didn't know, but I don't offhand recall instances where there were bitter clashes between the two.
Okay. Well, if you have nothing else to add.
Well, I can't think of anything directly, except I'd be kind of curious to see whatever happened to some of those folks. I'm not sure where they are now. But they were a neat bunch. Probably, I hope, had an influence out of proportion to their numbers.
Would you like to conclude the interview?
Sure.